That feeling, stepping over your own threshold. Usually it's a sigh of relief, a sense of safety maybe, home.
Right, the familiar comfort.
But what if you imagine that same familiar space sparking something totally different? What if your own home made you feel uneasy or even actually afraid?
It's a really interesting flip, isn't it? That whole relationship with home. And that's what we're digging into today. It centers around a word you might not have heard before. Oikophobia.
Oikophobia.
Right? It turns out it has this surprising kind of wide range of meanings. It unfolds differently depending on the time, the context, and that's exactly what we're going to try and unpack.
Exactly. We've got some fascinating sources here that look at oikophobia from, well, all sorts of angles, from its psychological roots to how it pops up more recently in political chat and even how early travelers used it.
Quite a journey for one word.
Totally. So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to navigate these different takes, try and give you a clearer picture of this really multifaceted idea, and hopefully, spark a few aha moments.
Sounds good.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe get grounded in that initial meaning, the psychiatric one.
Yeah, let's do that. So in psychology, the sort of core idea of oikophobia is an aversion, sometimes described as an abnormal fear, directed specifically at your own home.
Okay, fear of home.
Right. And you might sometimes hear another term, domatophobia. That one's a bit more specific. It focuses on the fear of the actual house, the physical building itself.
Ah, okay. So two slightly different flavors of fear connected to where we live. But the material also mentioned a more focused way oikophobia shows up psychologically, almost item specific.
Exactly. Yeah, beyond just a general fear of the home environment, it can actually narrow down to a phobia of the things inside the house.
The contents, like what?
Well, think about just, everyday household appliances, your fridge, the vacuum cleaner.
Seriously.
Yeah, or even things like the bathtub or chemicals like cleaning supplies. For some people, these specific items can become sources of really intense anxiety and fear. It really makes you think about how our sense of safety, even in our own space, isn't always guaranteed. It can be disrupted.
That's such a strange thought, isn't it? That the very objects meant to make life easier could actually become sources of distress. Okay, now let's take a sharp turn here. Because this word oikophobia, it actually has a much longer history.
Mm-hmm.
And its meaning was, well, pretty different back in the early 19th century, thanks mainly to the writer Robert Southey. This is where the story gets kind of weird.
It really does. So back in 1808, Southey wrote these letters from England, and in them he used oikophobia. But for him, it meant this widespread desire among the English to leave home, to travel.
Well, the wanderlust.
Essentially, yeah. For Southey and others writing around that time, it basically was a synonym for wanderlust.
Yeah.
That strong pull to just get out and explore.
That's a complete flip from the fear we were just talking about.
Totally.
And it wasn't just Southey using it like that. The sources say other writers picked it up too.
That's right. Throughout the 19th century, other writers adopted that meaning. Kind of paints a picture of a society, or, at least certain parts of it, feeling this real urge to get away from the familiar.
Why do you think the same word got used for such, well, opposite feelings? Fear versus desire to leave?
That's a great question. Maybe it just shows how complex our feelings about home can be.
Yeah.
It can be comfort, but it can also feel confining, maybe breed restlessness.
Makes sense.
Southey himself, he later noted that this type of oikophobia, the travel kind, seemed linked to, and this is his phrase, a certain state of civilization or luxury.
Ah, so being well off played a part.
He thought so. He pointed out how people with money would often leave home during the warmer months. They'd go off to spa towns, visit scenic resorts.
Like an early form of tourism.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He even specifically mentioned the trend, the fashion, for traveling up to the Scottish Highlands. It suggests this kind of leisure-driven desire to not be home, fueled by having the means to leave.
Right, the travel bug enabled by privilege. And we even have a quote showing this in action.
We do. There's a writer in 1829 reflecting on why they went to Brussels right after the Battle of Waterloo.
Okay.
And they wrote, quite plainly, that they gave way to my oikophobia as the reason for leaving England.
Wow, just spelled it out. Oikophobia made me do it.
Exactly. It really highlights how, in the 19th century, the word meant restlessness, a desire for new experiences you could only find away from home. It's like the opposite of homesickness, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And this meaning, this wanderlust interpretation, it seems like it stuck around for a while.
It did. The sources point to a book from much later, 1959 actually, by Bothina Abd el-Hamid Mohammed.
Okay.
And the title is Oikophobia, or a literary craze for education through travel. So it really cements that Sully interpretation, this idea of a literary fascination with leaving home to learn, to see the world, valuing experience over just staying put.
Fascinating. Okay, so two very distinct meanings mapped out. A psychological fear of home and a historical yearning to leave it. Wanderlust. But the story doesn't stop there, does it? There's a brief mention of it after World War II.
Yes, briefly. In the post-war period, some writers used the term, often kind of critically.
Yeah, so.
Well, they used it to describe what they saw as a fear and loathing of housework among women,
Mhm.
particularly women who were entering the workforce more.
Ah, so linked to changing gender roles.
That seemed to be the implication,
Yeah.
that these women were supposedly more drawn to consumerism, to life outside the domestic sphere, and this resulted in an oikophobia towards housework. It feels like a pretty loaded, maybe judgmental use of the term, looking back.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it reflects some anxieties about shifting social norms back then. Okay, so let's jump forward again to more recent times, and specifically the political use of oikophobia. This is mostly tied to the British philosopher Roger Scruton, right?
That's right. This is where the term takes another really significant turn.
How did he define it?
In his 2004 book, England and the Need for Nations, Scruton defined oikophobia as, and this is his phrase, the repudiation of inheritance and home.
Repudiation, so like rejection.
Exactly. Rejection of your own heritage, your own cultural home. He suggested it's maybe a normal developmental stage for adolescents, rejecting the familiar to find yourself.
But he didn't think it stopped there. He linked it to politics.
Precisely. He argued that oikophobia also shows up as a feature of certain political outlooks, which he generally placed on the left. These outlooks, he said, tend to display xenophilia.
Xenophilia, meaning a love of the foreign.
Yes, a preference for other cultures over one's own. So in Scruton's view, oikophobia becomes the direct opposite of xenophobia, the fear of the foreign. Instead of fearing the other, the oikophobe rejects their own.
Interesting. So turning away from your roots, your inheritance, and looking outwards instead. And others have kind of built on Scruton's idea.
Yes, Mark Dooley, who wrote about Scruton's philosophy, elaborated on this. Dooley connects this academic oikophobia to what he calls the assault on bourgeois society.
Okay.
He points to influential thinkers like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Now, very briefly, Derrida is known for deconstruction, questioning stable meanings, Foucault for analyzing power structures. Dooley, reading Scruton, argues that this kind of thinking creates an anti-culture,
An anti-culture, meaning
meaning a culture that's fundamentally critical of traditional Western values, norms, institutions.
and Dooley specifically calls Derrida a classic oikophobe. Why is that?
Well, Dooley argues that Derrida's philosophical method, because it questions fixed meanings and inherited structures, essentially repudiates the longing for home.
Not a physical home, but
Right, more the idea of home as rootedness, belonging, shared tradition. Dooley interprets Derrida's work as promoting a kind of rootless existence over the comfort of, say, national or traditional ties.
that's quite an interpretation, framing a philosophical stance as an aversion to home in that broader cultural sense. And the sources also mention an extreme aversion to the sacred being part of this.
Yes, that's presented as a key element. The argument put forward is that this political oikophobia isn't necessarily about replacing Western traditions with some other specific belief system. It's more about a fundamental opposition to the West's theological and cultural heritage itself.
Okay.
And sort of paradoxically, the idea is that this rejection can sometimes lead people to embrace viewpoints that might actually be more parochial or closed off than the traditions they're rejecting. It's a complex dynamic.
So a rejection of your own cultural foundations, sometimes without a clear or maybe even a more open alternative. And this whole concept, Scruton's idea, it seems to across the pond. It's used in the U.S. political context, too.
It has, yes. Some political commentators in the U.S. have picked up Scruton's definition. They use it to describe what they see as a rejection of traditional American culture, particularly people they identify as liberal elites.
Right, and the sources gave a specific example, that Wall Street Journal column from 2010.
That's the one. James Taranto wrote it, titled Oikophobia, Why the Liberal Elite Finds Americans Revolting.
Quite a title.
Indeed. He was specifically criticizing supporters of the proposed Islamic Center near Ground Zero in New York. Taranto accused them of oikophobia, essentially arguing they were defending Muslim sensibilities while looking down on or rejecting their own American culture and people.
Wow. Okay, so that's a very pointed, very contemporary political use of the term. Definitely shows how charged it can become.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
A clear, if obviously contentious example of Scruton's concept in action in a specific debate.
And it's not just a U.S. thing either. This political meaning has traction elsewhere.
It does. We see it in the Netherlands, for instance.
Right.
The politician and writer Thierry Baudet, he's actively used the term. He even wrote a book called Oikophobia, The Fear of Home.
Right.
So that suggests Scruton's framing has resonated more broadly in European political discussions, too, across different countries.
Okay, wow. So let's try and pull these threads together. We've gone from a psychological fear of the house, or even just the stuff in it,
Uh-huh.
all the way back to the 1800s, where oikophobia meant wanderlust, wanting to leave home.
Right.
And then this brief post-war thing about housework.
Yeah.
And finally, landing on this modern political meaning, rejecting your own culture, your home in that sense, maybe in favor of others. It's quite the journey for one word.
It really is. I think the main takeaway here is just how much the meaning depends on who's using it and when and why.
Mm.
It's incredibly context dependent.
Absolutely.
It's shifted so much over time, and it gets used very differently in psychology versus, say, political commentary. You really have to know the context to understand what someone means by oikophobia.
So thinking back to that initial idea, that feeling of home, comfort, safety, belonging, we now see how that very concept can be twisted into fear or a desire to escape or even this kind of cultural self-rejection, all bundled up in this one slippery word.
Mm-hmm. It adds so many layers to how we think about our connection or disconnection from the places and cultures we call home.
It really does, which maybe leads to a final thought for you listening.
Yeah, maybe something to chew on. Given all these different ways people have understood oikophobia, the fear, the wanderlust, the cultural rejection, how do you think the actual idea of home might be changing today in our world right now?
Good question.
And what might be driving those feelings?
Yeah.
Whether it's an aversion to home, whatever home means to you, or maybe even the opposite, an intensified longing for it. It's definitely worth mulling over these different angles we've talked about and what they might reveal about us and the times we live in.